I'm Dr. Rachel Paretsky. I'm your moderator today. I'm an associate professor in biological sciences at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I'm a microbial ecologist. I study microbial communities in biogeochemistry, public health. I'm also a member of ASM's Council on Microbial Sciences, the COMS group, and as part of COMS, I serve as a division counselor for microbial ecology. And I'm also on the board of a couple of ASM journals, Applied in Environmental Microbiology and M Systems. And like I said, I'm your moderator. And so just before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. So we'll start the presentation, and after the presentation, we'll have time for a few questions. So if you have questions, feel free to either raise your hand, shout it out, or put it in the chat. I'll keep my eyes on the chat for that. And then after that, Dr. Levin had some questions for us, for ASM members and participants. And so we're going to go into breakout rooms where we'll discuss those questions. ASM staff is here to help facilitate those breakout rooms and discussions, and then we'll regroup back here and continue some discussion and questions. So with that, I'll introduce our guest today, Dr. Phil Levin. He is the first director of the National Nature Assessment, which is housed under the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is part of the White House. And Dr. Levin joined this U.S. Global Change Research Program in April 2023. Prior to that, he had a joint appointment at the University of Washington and the Nature Conservancy, working as a professor of practice and the lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy of Washington. And ASM is excited about the launch of this National Nature Assessment, which was announced in April 2022. And this National Nature Assessment aims to take stock of U.S. lands, waters, wildlife, and the benefits that they provide to our economy, our health, climate, environmental justice, national security. And the idea is that this will be released, the first report will be released in 2026. And so back in September, ASM submitted comments to the National Nature Assessment prospectus, saying that it should include information about microbial diversity in the report, and specifically highlighting the links between microbial diversity and the proposed themes in the assessment, such as human health and safety and security and climate. And so just last week, the National Nature Assessment released its first call for authors and scientific and technical input. And so we'll put a link to that in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Levin, who will provide some more information about the National Nature Assessment and how microbiologists can get involved in helping to shape this report.
So first, thanks very much for inviting us to speak with you today. I'm Phil Levin. Also here is Tessa Francis, who's the Chief of Staff for the National Nature Assessment. And so we're both here to tell you, a little bit about what we've been thinking, but we're in the early stages. And this is really going to be driven by the authors, and we're in the process now of building guidance for the authors. What are some things that they should consider as they develop their chapters? And so the bottom line is we're here to learn more than anything else. And so we appreciate you taking the time and providing input for us. The other bottom line is, as Rachel mentioned, and Tessa also, I think, dropped in the chat, we are in the phase where we are soliciting nominations for authors as well as technical inputs into the assessment. So you can go here, you can nominate yourself to be an author, and that would be awesome. This also provides a link to, you'll have links to both the prospectus and the Federal Register, which provides more detail about the author call. So it's all, everything I'm saying, you can actually get through this link. Before everybody was here, I was saying I think it's 50% chance my dog will bark. I'm upping that to about 82% right now. So we'll see what happens when the UPS driver comes. Okay, so I just want to start by kind of, I think where there is the bar. I want to start where I think we should all start in a certain way, that nature is amazing. Nature has breathtaking beauty. There's intricate ecosystems, incredible biodiversity. And I think I am amazed with the complex adaptations, cycles, and patterns. And so for me, nature fuels innovation, it provides solace, and it really, I think, can teach us a lot of valuable lessons. And we're connected to nature in so many ways. The other thing we know is that nature is changing. We all see it. Maybe it's the timing of flowers in a field, or maybe it's new pathogens or invasive species that are showing up, or shifts in pollinator abundances, or droughts, just not enough water, or in some cases there's too much water with flooding. We see these changes, we feel these changes. At the same time, we know that nature is essential. We can't possibly achieve our national goals around equity, climate, jobs, and livelihoods without really thinking carefully about nature. But despite all this, we have, we have the sense in broad brush strokes that nature is changing, and there's data, bits and pieces all over the place, but we haven't brought it together. We just don't have a full picture of what's happening with nature in the US. And we don't really have a sense of how these changes translate to our lives today and to the future, for our well-being, for our kids' health, for future economic opportunities. And so that really was the genesis of the National Nature Assessment. It really started with an executive order on Earth Day in 2022. And on that executive order, there was essentially a very short thing that said, you should do an assessment of the condition of nature in the US. And it importantly pegged this into an older law from 1990, Global Change Research Act, which is the act which generally drives a lot of climate change research in our country. But this was the first time really that it was identified that nature and changes in nature, changes in biodiversity are really part of global change. The assessment is being conducted by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. This is an entity that, as I think Rachel mentioned, sits in the White House. And in the role of the Global Change Research Program is really to coordinate global change research and activities across 14 agencies that are really deeply engaged with global change issues. So these range from kind of data producers like NASA or Department of Interior or NOAA, EPA, but also into data users like Department of State and USAID. So, it's kind of, it's a really wide range of agencies. And so as Rachel mentioned, our scope, it really is broken down into two parts. The first part is to assess status, trends, and projections of what's going on. So on land and water, with life diversity and ecosystems in their entirety. And the second part is really focused on the benefits that nature provides. So what's the status, trends, and future projections of nature's benefits? So, and that includes equity, public health, the economy, even national security. So it's a twofold scope, and it's also massive. And And so part of what we needed to do is figure out how do we get this to a scope that we can actually accomplish something in the short time we have. This is due to be delivered in 2026. The first thing we wanted to be clear as we kind of scoped this is that we wanted to be use inspired. That is, we don't want to do an assessment in the absence of the users. And so that's our first principle. And the second is that it's inclusive. So it's inclusive to all sectors who might be interested in nature, which is pretty much everyone. We're also inclusive in the sense that we're embracing indigenous knowledge as an important body of knowledge that can contribute to the assessment, that can contribute to our understanding of how the world works. And there's a bunch of principles that are codified in some federal guidance on indigenous knowledge that we follow, so that we do this in a respectful and appropriate manner. And also part of being inclusive means, and use inspired means actually talking to people, real people. And so we've been engaged in a months-long, so pretty much this is what I've been doing, is going to groups and in different ways and trying to find out what is important to them. So this started with a Federal Register notice where we basically said, hey, what do you want us to do? And by the way, what is nature anyways? And that yielded 3,000 comments. And that was amazing because it really highlighted the breadth of interest across all walks of life. People who are really interested in nature and understanding it more and really wanting to engage in the process. We followed that up with a lot of engagement with different groups, including Native Hawaiians, tribes, and public events where we've reached 140 different organizations across the US. And what we did was we took all this input and used it to generate a prospectus, sort of a high-level work plan of what we thought we wanted to do. And I'm going to kind of run through quickly a high level of what's in that prospectus here. And you'll also, as I mentioned before, know that this is, if you go to globalchange.gov, there is a link to the prospectus so you can see it actually written if you want to see it on paper or on a screen. So our work is going to be really divided into 4 bins. The first bin is around conservation and resource management. The second is the economy. Third is health and well-being. And then the fourth is safety and security. And then we have 2 overarching themes that really cross over all these 4 major bins. Those are climate and equity. What I'll do now is kind of drop down and highlight a series of questions that we gleaned from all this input that we got from stakeholders, from tribes, and from federal agencies. And this is, so we're driven by these user questions, and they'll form the core of what we're after. You'll still see they're pretty high level, and that's why we're here today with you, is to begin to understand, what does this mean to you? How would we operationalize this in assessment in your area of expertise? So the first one is pretty straightforward, that you might expect from a nature assessment, and that we're asking about the status trends and drivers of change for species and ecosystems. And then we have 2 other things that are a little bit maybe more unique for an assessment of this sort. One is we're focused on access to nature. So it's one thing to have nature exist, but if you don't have access to it, you don't have the benefits. And so we'll also be looking at access to nature. And then also, in addition to sort of the usual thing you might expect around imperiled species, threatened, endangered, or whatever, keystone species, we're looking at those species that have cultural significance, either species or ecosystems. In the economic realm, as you might have guessed, when we go out and talk to people, people are interested in jobs and livelihoods. And so we'll have a series of questions about that. And then especially related to how does that connect to nature, and what are options that where we could advance the economy and provide net benefits for nature and climate. And then also, as you probably see like code words here, so how would future infrastructure, which is something that this administration is very interested in, and economic development advance with providing lots of benefits in the least amount of harm. And I'll take a little bit more time to talk about human health and well-being. It's really a couple straightforward questions where we're asking about how changes in nature affects physical, mental health and equity of health risks, and what are emerging effects from changes in nature, and what are nature-based solutions to help reduce health risks. I think this is an interesting one because on the surface, it's obviously difficult to do, and the research is deep and wide. But like nature, if you ask people what is health, you get quite different perspectives. And in the spirit of being inclusive, we will guide our authors to think inclusively and broadly about things like health, and this will occur throughout the assessment as well. I'm using this just as an illustration. And so this is work that was done by Jamie Donatuto, who works with the Swinomish tribe in the Pacific Northwest, and she worked with the community and asked the community to say, hey, so what is health and how would we measure it? And this was NIH funded work. And when you did that, you came up with a really a broad array of metrics that are quite different than, let's say, you would see in coming from the CDC or something like that. Like it's so thinking about connection of people to each other and to nature, the ability to have self-determination, their agency and power, and security of the natural resources that support their culture and use of their culture, and even intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And so that is how they define health. And so I think it gives us a really interesting window on ways to think about this particular chapter. Another framing that folks have mentioned is, you may be familiar with, is the One Health framing, which really talks about this overlap between human health, environmental health, and animal health. Oftentimes, like in this image, there's a bat, which you're thinking in that sense perhaps about diseases, wildlife diseases, and farm animals. This is a photograph of somebody who's an oyster farmer. So thinking in that sense about the marine ecosystem, the health of those oysters, and the people who work in that industry. And then the last bin is safety and security. And here there's really two things going on. One is around natural hazards like floods and fire, and how could they be averted by nature, and how can we use nature-based solutions to equitably reduce future risks. And the second theme here is food and water security. And so this could be broadly construed to be like for tribes, when people talked about it, it's really around subsistence and culturally important foods, where we could also think about this more broadly, like commercial industrial agriculture, where we might be thinking about soil health, pollinators, and so forth. And so what are we going to produce? We're going to be driven by knowledge, again, inspired by use and users, and we will have a report that of sort of the thing that you have to do when you work for the government. We are going to answer these key questions and connect them to actual users and places where the answers could be used in policy and management. We're also working hard to develop a suite of associated products outside of reports. So one of the things we heard over and over again was how important it is for people to be able to express their observations, their own assessment of what's happening in nature in their own voice. And the other thing that's really apparent is there's a huge diversity of perspectives on this. So what counts as nature is quite different to someone who lives in a city than someone who lives in rural areas on a farm versus a forest and so forth. And so we want to capture that in people's own words and their own voices. And we're developing a series of products that we're still scoping that will do that. And so we would love to ask you 3 questions to help us refine what I've shown you before, which is still very broad, and help us give guidance to authors and allow your voice to be expressed in the assessment. So the first is, what does nature mean to you? Or what, right? So it's like, what is nature? What is it? How do you conceptualize nature? The second question is, what topics would be most valuable for NNA to address the National Nature Assessment? And the third question is, what kinds of products should we generate? This information will be super helpful for us, and we'll definitely use it, and as I said, provide to authors, but also in our own thinking. We're getting a lot of good ideas. And so what's happening next? There is at globalchange.gov a call for authors that's open now. That's open until January the 4th. The nomination process for yourself, for others, is very straightforward. Seems to be working smoothly. People are not complaining, and it doesn't seem to take very long at all. So I encourage folks who are interested to lean in and nominate yourself to be an author. That's the best way to get different topics represented, for sure. We'll be, as I mentioned, developing author guidance this fall into the winter, and that's going to be really kind of the vague, I would still say, guidance we're going to give to authors to consider. Like, you might say, don't leave out soil microbiomes or something like that. So it's at that level, consider this, consider that. We'll be building the author teams in the winter, and then we will generate our first, what we call kind of a 0 order draft, which is really a detailed outline by the end of the spring next year. And again, the final draft is due in 2026. So it's a pretty short timeline to do a massive amount of work. I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions or clarify anything. Thanks.
Thanks for that overview. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or just, we're a small enough group, you can speak out or raise your hand. Stanley, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Phil. I think one thing that probably most people in this group feel is that very often when people talk about nature, they talk about things you can see, and they miss out on the microbes. And the microbes are a core part both of the health of nature and illness for, when things go wrong, but also in solutions to these problems. And so I just want to make a strong argument that microbes should be there, and they should be there in a way that people can understand this importance, so that the importance isn't invisible, even though the microbes are.
I think that's well said. Thanks. Thank you. And I would say, as I was thinking about speaking with you today, I'm a fish ecologist. Oh, so I was like, okay, microbes, and I'd start thinking about, well, there's soil microbiomes, gut microbiomes. I'm thinking about nitrogen fixing bacteria, processes around decomposition, sort of the kind of big ecological processes, and then also some of the solutions like you mentioned. And what I realized for me, and I don't know if this actually matters, but it's sort of like, what can microbiology do for me, rather than also thinking about microbiology as or microbes as an end, the end. So it's like, oh, is this all about fish diversity or mammal diversity or insect diversity or plant diversity or whatever? Or I think if we get the right authors, we can also think about microbial diversity as an end, not just as an end to a mean, if that makes sense, or means to an end. Sorry. But honestly, it will require folks leaning in who have expertise in this area, because the chapters are going to be drafted by people who have finite areas of expertise. And so I think as you folks lean in, that will provide us with that expertise and the knowledge to treat things appropriately and fully.
I just wanted to say I certainly agree. One of the things that I'm doing this semester is actually teaching a course on global change and the impacts of microorganisms, both positive and negative and all. And one of the things that we focused on today was how can you essentially utilize microorganisms to help with agriculture? And so I brought up the fact that, well, let's think about what these the crops are and all, and what do they most closely match out in the environment and nature. And we started to talk about grasslands, and that the grasslands, those that are still relatively undisturbed, could possibly present us with better ideas of what the microbial communities should be encouraged to be around our crops, so that we can use less fertilizer and stuff like that. So I guess one of the main points that I want to make is that not only should we focus on microbial diversity, because microbial diversity is important, but once we lose that microbial diversity, we won't be able to go back and get microorganisms and other community members that can actually help us solve some of these really large problems.
Yep. And in that way, you know, it's people talk, even like random people I know talk about insect diversity in a similar way. But I think it's Stanley who mentioned about, you know, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not as valuable. So it's sort of like there's almost this hierarchy. And I think this is an opportunity to raise the sort of things that you're talking about in a way that can connect to people.
Before, maybe if we have a minute, we can discuss, but I do want to just mention two things real quick. One is that the recording of this obviously will be shared with everyone. You'll get the link. And the other is that there's another Meet the Policy webinar on January 17th at 2. And it's with the National Climate Assessment folks. So check out the registration for that if you're interested. And also thanks, Phil, for bringing us this information, and everybody, ASM, for helping to facilitate the discussion. I don't know about you all, but our breakout room was interesting. And so we do have like 2 minutes if anybody has like overarching end comments, or if Bill or anybody else wants to say anything. Tessa, to close, I will open the floor for that. And thanks everyone for participating, of course.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. I really appreciate it. You know, this is not my area of expertise, and so it's extra valuable for me to begin to think through more carefully about how to incorporate microbes in our assessment and our thinking. And I also really appreciated some of the great ideas people had for products. Like there's a couple things like that I will be taking away and put in our list and see what we can do, including a children's book, which I really now want to do. And I like this, what is it? Auger art. I think that could be fun.
I was going to ask if there's ways to reach out to you all outside of this, if we have, oh, go ahead, Nicole.
Oh, no, I was just I got the same question privately in the chat of how, Phil and Tessa, how should people get in contact with you?
We just dropped our emails in the chat. So yeah, please continue the conversation with us. If more thoughts occur to you or just to stay engaged. And man, based on my breakout group, I would say I really, really hope that some of you are considering nominating yourselves as authors. These are just really important perspectives that we need to bring into the author teams. So please go to that call and share it in your networks.
Globalchange.gov.
All right, we're just at the top of the hour. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and thanks again for joining.